What if a civilization more powerful than anything the ancient world had ever seen simply vanished, not slowly, not through conquest or famine or the slow collapse of empire, but in a single day and a single night beneath the waves, leaving nothing behind but a story told by a philosopher who may have invented it entirely? For over 2,000 years, people have searched for Atlantis. Governments have funded expeditions. Scientists have mapped ocean floors, and still no one can agree whether it ever existed at all. Tonight, we trace the entire history of that question. The camera pushes west, past the Greek islands, past the boot of Italy, past the coast of North Africa where the desert meets the sea, all the way to the place where the ancient world believed the world itself ended. Two massive rocks, one on the European side, one on the African. The Pillars of Hercules. Beyond them, only darkness. Only the open Atlantic. Only the unknown. And somewhere out there, according to one man, lay the ruins of the greatest civilization that ever breathed. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. Athens. 360 years before the birth of Christ, the city smells of olive oil and charcoal smoke, of the sea drifting in from the Saronic Gulf, of animals moving through the agora in the early morning. It is a city that has survived everything. Persian invasion, plague, a catastrophic war that lasted nearly 30 years and nearly destroyed it from within. That war, the Peloponnesian War, ended in 404 BCE. Athens lost, Sparta won. And in the aftermath, something broke inside the city, not just the buildings. The idea Athens had believed in itself deeply, almost arrogantly. It had called itself the school of Greece, the model of civilization, the proof that democracy and reason could build something eternal. Then it bled itself dry in a generation-long war against its own neighbors, its fleet destroyed, its empire gone, its pride in ruins. Into that broken city, a philosopher named Plato watched and thought and wrote. He was not a young man dreaming of glory. By the time he composed the dialogues that would contain the Atlantis story around 360 BCE, he was in his late 60s. He had seen everything. The death of his teacher Socrates, executed by the very democracy Plato had grown up believing in. The chaos of the 30 tyrants who briefly seized Athens after the war. The slow, grinding disappointment of watching a great city fail to live up to its own ideals. Plato had spent his life asking one question: what makes a good society? And what destroys one? He answered that question in dozens of works: the Republic, the Laws, dialogues that ranged across justice and beauty and the nature of the soul, but in two particular works, the Timaeus and the Critias, he embedded something different. Something that read less like philosophy and more like a news report from the distant past. He told the story of Atlantis. The Timaeus opens with a gathering of men in conversation. Socrates is there, as he is in nearly all of Plato's dialogues. With him are three others: Timaeus of Locri, Hermocrates of Syracuse, and a man named Critias. They are continuing a discussion from the day before. Socrates has been describing his ideal city, and now Critias says he has a story. A true story, he insists. Not a myth, not a fable. something that actually happened. Critias says the story came from the Athenian statesman Solon. Solon, who lived roughly 200 years before Plato's time, was one of the most respected figures in Greek history. A lawgiver, a wise man, a man whose word carried enormous weight. Critias says that Solon traveled to Egypt, to a city called Sais in the Nile Delta, where he spoke with priests who kept records going back thousands of years. And those priests told Solon something extraordinary. They told him that 9,000 years before their conversation, before the time of Solon himself, before the rise of Greece or Egypt as anyone knew them, there had been two great powers in the world. One was ancient Athens, virtuous, disciplined, the ideal city in its purest form. The other was Atlantis. Atlantis, the priests said, lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. It was vast, larger than the landmass of Libya and Asia combined, which in ancient geographical terms meant an almost incomprehensible size. It was an island empire, rich in every resource the earth could offer. It had forests and mountains and plains. It had hot springs and cold springs. It had metals, including a mysterious alloy called orichalcum, which glowed red like fire and was second in value only to gold. The Atlanteans built a capital city of extraordinary beauty. Concentric rings of land and water surrounded a central hill where the original kings had lived. Bridges connected the rings. Canals cut through them. The walls were coated in bronze, in tin, in orichalcum. At the center stood a temple to Poseidon, god of the sea, who, according to the legend, had fathered the Atlantean royal line himself. For generations, the Atlanteans were noble, wise, content with what they had. But then something changed. The divine blood in their veins diluted over time. Human nature began to win. Greed took hold. Ambition, the desire for conquest. They built armies. They moved against the Mediterranean world. They almost won. Almost. Ancient Athens, the virtuous city, stood against them alone. Every other Greek state had already fallen or surrendered, but Athens held. Athens drove the Atlanteans back. And then, before the story could fully resolve itself, the gods intervened. Zeus looked down at the Atlanteans. He saw their corruption. He called a council of the gods to decide their fate. And that is where the Critias dialogue stops, mid-sentence. The manuscript simply ends, whether Plato never finished it, or whether the ending was lost, or whether the abrupt stop was intentional. No one alive can say. What we do have is the account in the Timaeus. The priests told Solon that in a single day and a single night of violent earthquakes and floods, the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea. Gone. Completely. And the Athenian army that had been fighting it was swallowed too, lost in the same catastrophe. 9,000 years of silence followed. Now, stop and feel the weight of those numbers. 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. Solon visited around 590 BCE. That places Atlantis at approximately 9,600 years before the birth of Christ. That is not ancient history. That is prehistory. That is before agriculture, before the wheel, before any written language anywhere on Earth. Plato was not describing a forgotten Bronze Age kingdom. He was describing something that should have left no trace at all, which raises the first question that has haunted every person who has ever read these dialogues. Did Plato believe it? Was he recording a genuine tradition, however garbled and transformed by time? Or was he constructing a myth with a very specific purpose. Because here is what you have to understand about Plato. He was not a historian, he was a philosopher, and in his philosophical works he used stories the way a carpenter uses tools, purposefully. The allegory of the cave in the Republic is not a real cave. The myth of air at the end of that same work is not a real soldier's near-death experience. They are constructions built to carry a specific weight of meaning. Athens, after the Peloponnesian War, was a city obsessed with its own greatness and haunted by its own failure. The story of Atlantis spoke directly into that wound. Here was a civilization that had everything: power, wealth, beauty, a divine inheritance, and it destroyed itself through arrogance, through the belief that more was always better, through the corruption that follows when a society stops valuing virtue and starts valuing conquest. The warning could not have been clearer if Plato had written it in fire across the sky. But then there is the chain of transmission, and this is where things get genuinely strange. Critias, speaking in the dialogue, explains exactly how this story reached him. The Egyptian priests told it to Solon. Solon brought it back to Athens, but never wrote it up as a finished poem. Though he apparently intended to, he told it instead to Drophides, his close friend and Critias's great-grandfather. Drophides told it to Critias the Elder, his son. Critias the Elder told it to young Critias, the man speaking in Plato's dialogue when Critias was about 10 years old. 4 generations of oral transmission, a story passed from a priest in Egypt to a Greek statesman to a family line across roughly 2 centuries, arriving finally in the mouth of a 10-year-old boy. Critias even admits in the dialogue that the details had grown hazy, that he had to work hard the night before to recall everything he had been told as a child. He says the story came back to him slowly, like a dream returning after waking. That single admission has fueled arguments for 2,500 years. Is this Plato being honest about the fragility of memory and oral tradition? Or is it Plato covering his tracks, creating plausible distance between himself and a story he invented? There is no clean answer. There never has been. What makes it stranger still is the source Plato chose. Solon was real. Absolutely. Historically real. One of the 7 sages of Greece. The man who reformed Athenian law and is credited with laying the groundwork for democracy itself. His reputation for wisdom and honesty was unimpeachable. By anchoring the Atlantis story to Solon, Plato gave it the most credible possible source. And Sais was real too. A genuine Egyptian city in the Nile Delta, with genuine temples and genuine priests who genuinely kept ancient records. The Greeks had real contact with Sais. The detail is not invented geography, but here is the detail that changes everything. The man Plato chose to tell this story, Critias, was not fictional. He was real. He was Plato's own relative, and he was one of the most feared and despised men in Athenian history, a man who ruled through blood and silence. Why would Plato put the most important story in the ancient world in the mouth of a tyrant? Whoever Plato chose to speak, the world he described was staggering in its detail. Not the vague, dreamy geography of myth, not the soft edges of legend. What Plato put into Critias's mouth reads less like a story and more like an architect's brief. A surveyor's report. The kind of document you produce when you want someone to be able to build the thing. So close your eyes for a moment. Picture it. The island sits beyond the Pillars of Hercules, out in the open Atlantic. It is larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. Mountains crowd the northern coast, rising steeply from the sea. But inland, stretching south, lies an enormous plain, rectangular, almost perfectly flat, roughly 550 kilometers long and 370 kilometers wide. Plato gives you the dimensions and stadia. He gives you the numbers. That specificity should comfort you. It doesn't. At the heart of the island stands a hill, low, rounded, unremarkable in itself. But this is where everything began, because this is where Poseidon fell in love. Her name was Cleito, the daughter of Evenor and Leucippe, two mortals who lived on that hill and then died, leaving their daughter alone. Poseidon found her, and what he did next tells you everything about the kind of god he was. He didn't simply take her. He built her a fortress. He carved the mountain into a palace and surrounded it with 3 circular moats of water, each one wider than the last, alternating with rings of land, all of them perfectly concentric, all of them centered on the hill where Cleito lived. A god drawing rings around the woman he loved, walls made of water, no bridge, no entrance, just ocean wrapping her in circles. Their children inherited the island. 5 pairs of male twins, 10 sons in total, each given a portion of the land to rule. The eldest was Atlas, and the ocean around the island took his name. His twin Gadiaris received the far western edge, toward the Pillars of Hercules. The other 8 brothers ruled their own territories across a vast empire that stretched beyond the island itself, controlling parts of the European continent and the coast of Libya as far as Egypt. 10 kings, a confederation, ruling together in a system Plato describes with almost constitutional precision. Every 5 or 6 years, the kings would gather at the temple of Poseidon at the center of the city. They came to renew their oaths and to judge one another. Before the ceremony, they hunted bulls, alone, without weapons, using only nooses and wooden staves. They chased the sacred animals through the temple grounds until one was caught. They sacrificed it over a pillar on which the laws of the confederation were inscribed. They mixed the blood with wine. They drank. Plato describes the ritual like a man who has attended something similar. The smell of it is in the text. The blood on stone, the wine going dark. Now look at the city itself. The Atlanteans built bridges northward from the central hill, connecting the rings of land to the rest of the island. They dug a great canal from the sea to the outermost ring of water, wide enough and deep enough for the largest ships. Through the rings of rock they carved tunnels, so that vessels could pass from one ring to the next, traveling inward toward the palace at the center. The docks were cut directly from the rock walls, and everywhere, ships. The harbors were thick with them, Plato says. Merchants arriving from every direction, loading and unloading, the noise of commerce rising above the water. The walls surrounding each ring were extraordinary, red rock, white rock, and black rock, all quarried from the moats themselves, giving the city a striped, almost theatrical appearance. But the stone was just the foundation. The outer wall was coated in brass. The next ring's wall gleamed with tin, and the innermost wall, the one surrounding the palace and the temple of Poseidon, was covered in orichalcum. Stop on that word, orichalcum. Plato describes it as a metal that gleamed like fire, second in value only to gold. The Atlanteans mined it from the earth, and they used it to face their most sacred walls, so that the entire central island blazed in the light. What orichalcum actually was, no one has ever agreed. Some ancient writers thought it was a copper alloy. Some believed it was simply brass described poetically. Others have argued It was entirely invented. What matters is what Plato does with it. He gives the most precious, most mysterious substance in his story to the walls of a temple. He makes the center of Atlantis literally glow. The temple of Poseidon stood inside those shining walls. A single stadium in length, 300 feet wide, and built to a height that felt, Plato says, somehow barbaric in its excess. The outside was covered in silver, with pinnacles of gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory inlaid with gold and silver and orichalcum. A gold statue of Poseidon stood at the center, so tall that his head nearly touched the roof, driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 nereids riding dolphins. This is not sparse. This is not restrained. This is a civilization drowning in its own wealth. And that, it turns out, is exactly the point. Because Plato does not simply describe Atlantis. He charts its moral trajectory, and the arc bends downward. In the beginning, he says, the Atlanteans were noble. They carried within them the blood of Poseidon, and that divine inheritance kept them honest. They valued virtue above gold. They treated their vast wealth with a kind of serene indifference. The way you treat something you know does not actually matter. They were, in Plato's telling, what wealthy people should be, but never are. But the divine blood thinned. Generation after generation, the mortal inheritance grew stronger, and the godly nature receded. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their character changed. They began to care about the gold, then they began to need it. Then they began to do things for it. The wealth that had once meant nothing to them became the measure of everything. They grew arrogant. They grew hungry. They looked outward. The Atlantean Empire pushed east. Their forces swept across the coast of Libya as far as Egypt. They moved into Europe, pushing as far as Tyrrhenia, in what is now central Italy. They enslaved the peoples they conquered. They were building towards something larger. What they wanted, Plato says, was everything. Everything inside the Pillars of Hercules. The whole Mediterranean world. One city stopped them. Athens, a proto-Athens, 9,000 years before Plato's time, a city that does not appear in any other historical record, a city that Plato describes in terms that should make you pause. This ancient Athens was everything the Athens of Plato's own day was not. Selfless, courageous, governed by wisdom rather than ambition. When the Atlantean tide swept east and the other Greek cities fell away, this Athens stood alone. Its soldiers fought on, even after their allies collapsed, even when they faced the full force of the Atlantean Empire without support. They won. Plato says it plainly. Ancient Athens, fighting alone, defeated the greatest naval empire the world had ever seen and liberated the occupied lands. Then the gods intervened. Zeus looked down at the Atlanteans, at what had become of Poseidon's children, and he called the gods together. He wanted to punish them, to remind them of what they had lost. The divine assembly gathered. Zeus opened his mouth to speak, and the text ends. Not with a conclusion, not with a summary, not even with a completed sentence. The Critias dialogue simply stops, mid-thought, in the middle of Zeus's speech, and there is nothing after it. No continuation, no resolution. The punishment Zeus was about to announce has never been recorded. For over 2,000 years, no one has known what he was going to say. Before you sit with that silence, though, sit with what came just before it. Look at what Plato built here. and ask yourself what it is actually for. The Atlantis of the Critias is not just a lost civilization. It is a mirror. Every detail has a counterpart. The Atlanteans begin noble and end corrupt. Ancient Athens begins virtuous and remains virtuous. Atlantis is wealthy beyond measure and falls. Athens is disciplined and wins. The empire that controls the sea is defeated by the city that controls itself. Plato had spent his life arguing that the ideal state was not a democracy, not an oligarchy, not a tyranny, but a city governed by philosophical wisdom, by men who had trained their desires and subordinated personal ambition to the common good. He had written that argument out in the Republic, and now, in the Timaeus and Critias, he had found a way to dramatize it, to make it bleed and breathe. Ancient Athens is the Republic made flesh. Atlantis is every corrupted state Plato had ever watched destroy itself through appetite and pride. One scholar, writing in the 20th century, put it with the kind of precision that cuts. Plato was not describing the past, he was diagnosing the present. And here is where the suspicion that has been building since the last chapter sharpens into something almost uncomfortable. Plato chose Critias to tell this story, a man who had ruled Athens through terror, a man who had used fine words to justify blood. If anyone in Athenian memory embodied the corruption Plato describes in the Atlanteans, the descent from nobility into appetite and violence, it was Critias. The man standing at the center of this dialogue about moral collapse had himself been the most spectacular example of it. Was that a coincidence? Plato was not a man who made accidental choices, so now the description of Atlantis, which started as wonder, starts to feel like something more calculated. The concentric rings and the gleaming walls and the orichalcum and the 10 kings and the sacred bulls, all of it gorgeous, all of it specific, all of it designed to make you believe in a place so fully that when Plato tells you what went wrong there, you feel the weight of it. The more real Atlantis seems, the harder the fall. The more you can see those shining walls, smell the salt and the blood at the sacrificial pillar. Feel the cold spray off the harbor as 1,000 ships move in the morning, the more devastating it becomes when Plato tells you that all of this, every ring of it, every gleaming surface, sank in a sin. Day and night, violent earthquakes, floods. One catastrophic moment in which the warlike men of ancient Athens sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis disappeared into the sea, gone. And in its place a shoal of mud, impassable and dark, blocking the way so that no ship could follow, which brings you back to Zeus, standing before the assembled gods, opening his mouth. Plato's text ends in the middle of a sentence. Zeus opens his mouth to speak, and then nothing. For over 2,000 years, no one has known what he was about to say. Some scholars believe Plato died before he could finish. Others believe he stopped deliberately, that the silence was the point. But a third group believes something far more troubling, that Plato never needed to finish it, because it was never meant to be read as history at all. Plato had barely set down his stylus before the argument began. The ink was not dry on the Timaeus and the Critias before the scholars of Athens were already splitting into two camps, two groups facing each other across the same scrolls, reading the same words, and arriving at completely opposite conclusions. One side said, "This is real. This happened." The other side said, "This is a parable, a warning dressed in geography, and the extraordinary thing, the thing that should stop you cold, is that this argument sounds completely familiar. Because you have heard it before, you are hearing it right now. This is not a modern debate. It is as old as the story itself. The first man to take Atlantis seriously as history was a philosopher named Crantor of Soli. He lived roughly a generation after Plato, around 300 BCE, and he had the rare distinction of being the first person we know of to write a formal commentary on Plato's work. He was, in the truest sense, Plato's first editor, his first serious reader. And what Crantor did next is either one of the most remarkable acts of scholarly verification in ancient history, or one of the most remarkable acts of wishful thinking. He sent messengers to Egypt, specifically to the city of Sais, the same city where Solon had supposedly heard the story from the priests, the same temple, the same tradition, and according to Crantor, those messengers came back with a report. The priests at Sais confirmed it. The story of Atlantis, they said, was recorded on columns in their temple, written there in the old script, preserved, real. Think about what that means if it is true. It means the story had a physical source, stone, carved letters, a record that predated Plato by thousands of years. Crantor believed it completely. He staked his reputation on it, and for a while, in certain circles of the ancient world, that was enough. But not for everyone. Because Aristotle was watching. Plato's most famous student had sat in his teacher's academy for 20 years. He had heard Plato speak. He had read every word the man wrote. And Aristotle's verdict on Atlantis was swift, sharp, and devastating. He believed Plato invented it. All of it. The island, the kings, the rings, the war, the flood. A literary device, a philosophical tool, and the line that Aristotle reportedly used has survived more than 2,000 years because it is simply too perfect to forget. The man who invented it also destroyed it. 6 words. Brutal. Final. The implication is clear. Plato needed Atlantis for his argument. So he created it, and when the argument was complete, he sank it. The island's disappearance was not a geological event. It was a narrative convenience. Aristotle was saying, with elegant contempt, that the whole thing was fiction. Now here is the tension that should make your head spin a little. Crantor had sent messengers to Egypt and found confirmation. Aristotle had sat at Plato's feet and found invention. Both men were brilliant. Both men had access to sources and traditions we no longer possess, and they disagreed completely. The argument did not settle, it deepened. Centuries passed, the world changed. Rome rose and absorbed Greece, and with it, absorbed the whole Greek philosophical tradition, the way a river absorbs a smaller stream. And in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, a new school of thought emerged, one that would reshape how educated Romans and Greeks read everything Plato had ever written. They were the Neoplatonists, and for them, Atlantis was neither history nor simple fiction. It was something stranger and more beautiful than either. It was a cosmic myth. The philosopher Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century, saw Plato's dialogues as maps of the soul's journey, not maps of the physical world, maps of the interior world, the descent from unity into multiplicity, from the divine into the material, from light into matter. For Plotinus, the story of Atlantis was not about an island. It was about the soul of humanity, glorious and powerful and spiritually gifted, corrupting itself through attachment to the physical world, sinking, not into the ocean, into matter itself. It is an extraordinary reading, and once you hear it, you cannot entirely unhear it. His student Iamblichus pushed further. He saw the entire structure of the Timaeus and Critias as a single unified cosmological meditation. The 10 kings of Atlantis were not historical rulers. They were symbolic figures representing the descent of divine principles into human form. The concentric rings of the island were not geography. They were a diagram of the soul's layers, moving from the spiritual center outward into the physical. You might think this sounds like overreading, like scholars so hungry for meaning that they find it everywhere. But consider this. These were not casual readers. They were men who had devoted their entire lives to Plato's texts, who read Greek the way you breathe air, who had access to traditions and commentaries we have lost entirely. When they said Atlantis was allegory, they were not guessing. They were working from a deep reading of how Plato constructed his philosophical myths throughout his entire body of work. And then there was Proclus. Proclus of Athens, writing in the 5th century CE, is the figure who tried to hold the entire argument together without letting either side win. His commentary on the Timaeus is one of the most detailed pieces of ancient scholarship we possess. And in it, he does something remarkable. He catalogues every opinion about Atlantis he can find. He lists the believers and the skeptics. He cites ancient writers who mentioned other large islands in the Atlantic Ocean, islands that other navigators had reportedly encountered as potential corroboration for Plato's geography. He tries, with enormous intellectual care, to show that the allegorical and historical readings are not mutually exclusive. That Plato could have used a real tradition as the foundation for a philosophical myth, the way a painter uses a real face as the foundation for an idealized portrait. It is a generous reading, a careful one, and it satisfied almost no one, because the people who wanted history wanted pure history, and the people who wanted allegory wanted pure allegory. The smell of those old libraries, if you can imagine it, was papyrus and lamp oil, and the particular dry warmth of scrolls that have been handled by hundreds of hands. The sound was the scratch of styluses and the low murmur of men reading aloud to themselves, the way scholars did in the ancient world, because silent reading was considered strange. In those rooms, the argument about Atlantis was alive, debated, urgent, and then, slowly, it stopped, not because the argument was resolved, because the world that had been asking the question began to disappear. Christianity arrived in Rome not as a whisper, but as a flood. By the 4th century, it was the official religion of the empire, and with it came a new set of questions, a new framework, a new story of origins. The world had been created in 6 days. Humanity had fallen in a garden. History moved in a straight line from creation to salvation. There was no room in this framework for a sophisticated Platonic myth about a sunken civilization that predated recorded scripture by 9,000 years. There was no room for the priests of size and their temple columns. There was no room for Proclus and his careful catalogues of Atlantic islands. The great philosophical schools closed. The academy in Athens, the institution Plato himself had founded, was shut down by the Emperor Justinian in 529 CE. The Neoplatonist tradition, which had kept the most sophisticated readings of Atlantis alive, was scattered. The scholars who had spent their lives inside those arguments were gone. Plato's texts survived. Barely. Monks copied them in cold scriptoriums, their fingers numb, their breath visible in the air. They preserved the words because Plato's logic had been useful to early Christian theologians, because the Timaeus in particular contained ideas about a divine creator that could be mapped imperfectly but usefully onto Christian theology. So the scrolls survived, the words survived, but the argument around them went silent. For nearly 1,000 years, the question of Atlantis, real or invented, history or allegory, geography or cosmic myth, simply stopped being asked in any serious public way. It was not answered, it was buried, the way you bury a question that makes people uncomfortable, not with a refutation, but with silence, with the slow accumulation of centuries during which no one with power and education thought it was worth asking. The monks who copied the Timaeus and the Critias were not thinking about sunken islands. They were thinking about salvation, about the immortality of the soul, about the passages in Plato that could be made to rhyme with scripture. The passages that could not be made to rhyme were simply set aside, not destroyed, set aside, left in the margins, waiting. And here is the thing about buried questions. They do not die. They wait. They wait in monastery libraries and in the careful handwriting of men who copied words they did not fully understand, in languages that were slowly becoming foreign, even to educated Europeans. They wait in the spaces between the arguments that were allowed and the arguments that were not. Atlantis waited for nearly a millennium, patient in the dark, preserved in Latin and Greek in rooms that smelled of tallow and cold stone and the particular silence of men who have taken vows not to speak unnecessarily. And then the lights went out, not metaphorically. The great library traditions of the ancient world faltered. Monasteries preserved Plato's texts, but stripped them of their controversy. For nearly 1,000 years, almost no one asked where Atlantis was, because almost no one was allowed to ask, until one man, standing on the deck of a ship at the edge of the known world, made a discovery that brought Atlantis roaring back. The silence lasted almost 1,000 years. Then a Genoese sailor crossed the ocean Plato had described and found land on the other side. Think about what that moment meant, not just to Columbus, to every scholar in Europe who had ever read the Timaeus and wondered, the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the land on the far side. Plato had written it down in 360 BC, and here, in 1492, a ship's prow was cutting through that exact water, salt spray cold on the hands of men who had no idea what they were about to prove. They were not looking for Atlantis, but Atlantis found them anyway. Within years of Columbus returning to Spain, scholars across Europe were pulling Plato's dialogues off monastery shelves. The same texts that had sat quietly in Latin for centuries, copied by monks who cared only for the philosophy and ignored the geography. Now the geography was the whole point. Candlelit rooms filled with the sound of turning pages, men leaning close to the vellum, fingers tracing Plato's words about the ocean beyond the pillars, about the great island, about the continent on the far side. Their hands were shaking, not from cold, from recognition, because here is what Plato had written. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, there lay an island. Beyond that island lay other islands. Beyond those islands lay a continent that encompassed the true ocean. A continent on the far side of the Atlantic. And now, suddenly, impossibly, there it was. The smell in those rooms was tallow smoke and old leather. The sound was silence broken only by breath. These were men experiencing something that has no clean modern equivalent. Imagine spending your whole life believing a story was pure philosophy, pure allegory, and then watching the allegory walk through the door. The Renaissance was already alive with the electricity of rediscovery. Ancient texts were being read with fresh eyes. The world was expanding in every direction at once. And now Plato, dead for nearly 1900 years, seemed to have described the Atlantic Ocean, the islands within it, and the continent beyond with a precision that made grown men go quiet and stare at walls. The question that had been buried for a millennium came roaring back. Not gently, not cautiously. It came back with the force of everything that had been suppressed. In 1552, a Spanish historian named Francisco López de Gomara put the thought into print for the first time. In his History of the Indies, he stated it plainly. Plato was referring to America. The New World was Atlantis. Not a metaphor, not an allegory. The actual place. The actual sunken empire. The Americas were what remained after the catastrophe, the high ground that had survived when the rest slipped beneath the sea. It was the first explicit identification anyone had ever published, and it landed like a stone in still water. The ripples moved fast. Cartographers began marking Atlantic islands as possible remnants. The Azores appeared on maps with annotations suggesting they were the mountain peaks of a drowned continent. The Canary Islands, Madeira. Every island in the Atlantic suddenly carried the weight of this question. Were these summits? Were these the last visible traces of something enormous and gone? Men drew maps showing a sunken landmass between Europe and the Americas, its contours speculative, its existence assumed. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer just water, it was a graveyard, and everyone wanted to know what was buried there. Francis Bacon watched all of this. He was a man who understood that myths could be tools, not just stories, instruments. In 1627, the year after his death, his unfinished novel appeared tucked into the back of a longer work on natural history. A strange place for it, an almost accidental publication. But what it contained would shape the Atlantis story for centuries. Bacon called it New Atlantis. He imagined a ship's crew lost in the Pacific, west of Peru, discovering an island called Benzalem. The island was populated by a civilization of extraordinary moral virtue and scientific achievement. At its heart was an institution called Solomon's House, a college of researchers who studied the natural world with systematic rigor. They sent agents to foreign countries to gather knowledge. They conducted experiments. They classified their discoveries. They asked questions and wrote down the answers. Bacon was not writing a story about the past. He was writing a blueprint for the future. Solomon's House prefigured what we would now call a research university. Its members were divided into roles that would be recognizable to any modern scientist. Some gathered raw information. Some ran experiments. Some analyzed results. Some turned discoveries into practical applications. Bacon gave them names: merchants of light, depredators, pioneers, lamps, interpreters of nature. The language was strange, but the structure was modern. He was describing the Royal Society 20 years before it existed, and he hung all of this on Atlantis. Bensalem's history connected it to Plato's lost civilization. The Americas, Bacon wrote through his narrator, were what remained of old Atlantis after a great flood had destroyed the rest. The Atlanteans had been a mighty civilization. Their descendants had survived in the New World. But Benzalem had survived too, quietly, unknown to Europe, perfecting itself in isolation while the rest of the world stumbled through ignorance. The genius of what Bacon did was to take a myth about catastrophic failure and turn it into an argument for human progress. Atlantis had fallen because it had reached too far, morally, militarily, spiritually. Bensalem had endured because it had reached far enough in the right direction. Science, reason, organized inquiry. The myth that Plato had invented as a warning against hubris became, in Bacon's hands, a manifesto for empiricism. New Atlantis influenced the formation of the Royal Society. It shaped how Europeans imagined the ideal civilization. It planted the idea that the New World could be the site of a better world. Thomas Jefferson would later name Bacon as one of the 3 greatest men who had ever lived. The United States Constitution carries traces of his thinking. The New Atlantis, in some sense, became America itself, but here is where the story darkens. Because not everyone who reached for the Atlantis myth in those years was reaching for progress. Some were reaching for something uglier, something that would do enormous harm. Spanish colonial writers looked at the indigenous peoples of the Americas. They looked at their ruins, their cities, their astronomical knowledge, their architecture, and they faced a problem. These were clearly the products of sophisticated civilization. But the ideology of conquest required that the people being conquered be inferior, primitive, unworthy. The ruins contradicted the story. Atlantis solved the contradiction. If the Americas were the remnants of Atlantis, then the indigenous peoples were not the builders of these civilizations. They were the degenerate survivors of a greater race. The true Atlanteans had been magnificent. These people were what was left after millennia of decline. The ruins were not their achievement. The ruins were their inheritance from a better people who no longer existed. It was a lie constructed from a myth, constructed from a philosophical allegory. 3 layers of fiction, stacked carefully, each one lending false authority to the next. And it worked. It gave conquest a historical framework. It stripped indigenous peoples of their own past and handed it to a civilization that had never existed. It said, in effect, that the Americas had always belonged to a higher order of people. The Spanish were simply restoring that order. This was not a fringe position. It circulated in published histories. It shaped how educated Europeans understood what they were doing in the New World. Atlantis, Plato's warning against imperial arrogance, became the justification for the most sweeping imperial project in human history. Pause on that for a moment. The irony is almost unbearable. Plato had created Atlantis as an empire that reached too far, that conquered without wisdom, that mistook power for virtue. And here were the inheritors of that story, using it to justify exactly the kind of conquest Plato had condemned. The myth had been turned completely inside out. The warning had become the weapon. And through all of this, the physical search continued. Cartographers kept drawing their speculative maps. The Azores kept appearing as candidates. The Flemish mapmaker Abraham Ortelius looked at the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and the Americas and noticed something. The shapes fit, not perfectly, but suggestively. The bulge of South America and the indent of the African coast. He wrote in 1596 that the Americas seemed to have been torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods, not sunk, torn away, drifted. He was groping toward continental drift 3 centuries before anyone had the science to confirm it, and Atlantis was the frame he used to think about it. The myth had become a lens. Every new discovery, every new coastline mapped, Every new island found got filtered through it. Is this Atlantis? Is this a remnant? Is this the proof? The question that Plato had planted, possibly as pure invention, had become the organizing question of an age. By the end of the Renaissance, Atlantis had done something Plato almost certainly never intended. It had escaped philosophy entirely. It was no longer a thought experiment about justice and hubris and the fate of nations. It was a geographical claim, a colonial justification, a utopian blueprint, a cartographic obsession, and a myth of racial origin all at once. Different people were using it to argue for completely opposite things. Bacon used it to argue for reason. Colonial writers used it to argue for conquest. Mapmakers used it to argue for a sunken continent. Scholars used it to argue for a sunken continent. Scholars used it to argue about everything. The story had become a mirror. Whatever you wanted to see in it, you could see. Whatever argument you needed to make, Atlantis could be made to support it. This is what happens when a myth gets loose in the world. It stops belonging to its creator. It stops meaning what it was meant to mean. It becomes whatever its users need it to be. Atlantis had been reborn. But it had been reborn as something Plato never intended. A justification, a projection screen, a blank canvas onto which every age could paint its own obsessions, and no one would paint on that canvas more obsessively, more dangerously, or more influentially than a 19th century American politician sitting in a Minnesota jail cell writing the book that would define how the entire modern world thinks about Atlantis. His name was Ignatius Donnelly. He had been a congressman, a visionary, a reformer, and a failure. And in 1882, sitting in political disgrace in Minnesota, he wrote the book that would convince millions of people that Atlantis was real. Look at the photographs of him. Broad face, dense, restless eyes, the look of a man whose mind never quite stops moving, even when his body has nowhere to go. Donnelly had been lieutenant governor of Minnesota at 30 years old. He had served in Congress. He had championed farmers against railroads, workers against industrialists, the forgotten against the powerful. He was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely convinced that he was right about everything. That last quality was the one that kept destroying him. By the time he sat down to write, the political world had chewed him up and spat him out. He was awaiting trial on political charges. His career was in ruins. But his mind was still running at full speed, still hungry, still reaching for something enormous. And the thing it reached for was Atlantis. What Donnelly produced was not a pamphlet or a curiosity. It was a 700-page argument. Dense, confident, relentless. He called it Atlantis, the antediluvian world, and he structured it around 13 specific theses he intended to prove. Not suggest, not explore. Prove that Atlantis had existed in the Atlantic Ocean opposite the Mediterranean, that Plato's account was not myth but history, that Atlantis was where human civilization first rose from barbarism, that every great ancient culture, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Aztecs, the peoples of the Amazon and the Mississippi and the Baltic, had all descended from Atlantean survivors, that the biblical flood was a memory of its destruction, that the gods of Greece and Scandinavia and India were simply the kings and heroes of Atlantis, half remembered through centuries of retelling. Every myth, every flood legend, every pyramid, every alphabet. All of it, in Donnelly's telling, traced back to one source, one lost island in the Atlantic, one supreme civilization that had seeded the entire world. The air in that Minnesota jail must have smelled of paper and cold stone. His hands must have ached from writing. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Because for Donnelly, Atlantis was not just ancient history. It was personal. Here is what the scholars who came after him understood and what most of his readers missed entirely. Donnelly was not really writing about the ancient world. He was writing about America. He was writing about the Reconstruction era, about industrialization tearing apart the agrarian frontier he had loved, about wealth concentrating in fewer and fewer hands, about a golden age that felt like it was ending. Atlantis, in his telling, was a civilization where a supreme race had ruled, but everyone still had a share, where greatness had existed before corruption set in, where the fall, when it came, was total and catastrophic. Sound familiar? It should. He was describing what he feared America was becoming. The decline of Atlantis was the decline he saw coming. He was just setting it 9,000 years in the past so people would read it. The book landed like a stone dropped into still water. The rings spread fast and wide. It went through dozens of editions. Prime ministers read it. William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, was so convinced by Donnelly's argument that he reportedly petitioned the British government to fund an ocean expedition to find the sunken continent. Think about that. The leader of one of the most powerful nations on Earth, asking for government money to go looking for a place Plato may have invented as a philosophical parable. That is how persuasive Donnelly was. That is how hungry people were to believe. And the hunger made sense. This was a world of dizzying change. Urbanization, industrialization, the old certainties dissolving. Donnelly offered something rare and intoxicating, a grand unified theory of human history, a story that made everything connect. If Atlantis was real, then the flood myths of 100 different cultures were not coincidence. They were memory. If Atlantis was real, then the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mexico were not parallel invention. They were inheritance. The chaos of history suddenly had a center, and that center was lost, drowned, mourned by all of humanity without any of us knowing why. It was a beautiful idea. That was the problem. Because Donnelly's method, underneath all that confidence, was built on a foundation that could not hold. He had genuinely read widely. He had genuinely engaged with the scholarship of his day. His pages on flood myths from dozens of cultures, on linguistic similarities between distant peoples, on shared architectural forms across continents, showed real effort. He was not a fool. He was something more dangerous than a fool. He was a brilliant man who had decided on his conclusion first and then went looking for evidence to support it. The technical term for what he practiced is hyperdiffusionism, the idea that all civilization flowed from one single source. When he found similar creation stories in the Old World and the New World, he did not ask whether human beings independently arrived at similar answers to similar questions. He asked which direction the river flowed from Atlantis. When he found that the Phoenician alphabet and the Mayan writing system shared certain features, he did not consider whether the similarities were superficial or coincidental. He drew a line straight back to an Atlantean original. Every similarity was proof. No similarity was too small to use. No difference was large enough to slow him down. The researcher Jason Colavito has pointed out something particularly damning. Parts of Donnelly's book were lifted almost word for word from John Thomas Short's earlier novel, The North Americans of Antiquity. Donnelly did not just borrow ideas, he borrowed sentences. For a man presenting himself as a rigorous scholar building an original case, that is a serious problem. But his readers did not know. They saw the footnotes, the charts, the linguistic comparisons, the illustrations. They saw the apparatus of scholarship, and they believed. Within decades, the scientific rebuttals began to arrive. Not slowly, rapidly. The discovery of plate tectonics showed that the ocean floor of the Atlantic had not recently collapsed. Deep-sea mapping found no evidence of a sunken continent. The geological record of the Atlantic Islands, the Azores, the Canaries, the Madeira Group, showed not submergence but steady uplift over millions of years. These were not places sinking, they were places rising. The ocean floor was not the grave of a civilization, it was exactly what it had always been. And then there was the writing. Donnelly had argued that the Phoenician alphabet descended from an Atlantean original, and that this same alphabet had been carried to the Maya of Central America, but as scholars mapped the actual development of writing systems across the world, the picture that emerged was the opposite of what he claimed. Writing had been invented independently, multiple times, in Mesopotamia, in China, in Mesoamerica. Different forms, different symbols, different logic. Not one river flowing outward from a single source, but multiple springs rising from the same deep human need to record and communicate. The independent invention of writing across cultures did not prove a common Atlantean ancestor. It proved that human beings, separated by oceans, facing similar challenges, arrive at similar solutions. Because we are all the same kind of animal. The scholar Sprague de Camp, reviewing Donnelly's work years later, reached a verdict that was as clear as it was brutal. Donnelly's facts were either wrong or had been disproven by subsequent discoveries. And even where the facts had not been wrong, he had still drawn the wrong conclusions from them. The methodology was broken at its core. You cannot prove a common origin by listing similarities. You have to rule out independent invention. You have to account for the differences, not just celebrate the parallels. Donnelly never did that. He never tried. None of this stopped the book from selling. None of it stopped the book from spreading. Here is where it gets complicated. Here is where admiration for a restless, brilliant, politically broken man has to give way to something harder. Because Donnelly's central vision of Atlantis was not just wrong. It was specifically wrong in a way that would cause real harm. He believed that Atlantis had been dominated by a superior white race. He wrote it plainly. His ideal Atlantis was a society where a white race ruled, but everyone still had a share. A kind of benevolent racial hierarchy, and his 13 theses, taken together, amounted to a claim that all the great civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt, Greece, the Aztec Empire, the cultures of the Amazon, had not built themselves. They had inherited their greatness from a superior source. They were echoes, reflections, colonies of a master civilization that no longer existed. You can hear what that argument makes possible. If no ancient culture built itself independently, then no modern culture needs to take seriously the achievements of the people who actually built those things. The pyramids were not Egyptian. The temples of the Maya were not Mayan. They were Atlantean. And Atlantis, in Donnelly's telling, was white. He probably did not see himself as a dangerous man. He saw himself as a visionary, a reformer, someone who had found the hidden truth beneath the surface of history. He had spent his whole career fighting for the forgotten and the dispossessed. The racial ideology woven through his Atlantis book sat alongside genuine populist conviction, without any apparent sense of contradiction. That is often how these things work. The poison does not announce itself. Helena Blavatsky read Donnelly's book and cited it repeatedly in The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888. She took his theory of a superior Atlantean race and built it into her theosophical framework. Her Atlanteans became the fourth root race in a hierarchy of racial evolution, the fifth root race that succeeded them. She called the Aryan race. Rudolf Steiner followed her. Others followed him. Donnelly's book gave Atlantis to the masses. But in doing so, it also gave Atlantis to something darker, because Donnelly's central idea that one supreme civilization had seeded all others did not stay in the hands of curious readers and amateur archaeologists. It traveled, it mutated, and in the early 20th century, it arrived in the hands of people who would use it not to explain the past, but to justify what they intended to do to the future. Blavatsky had given the idea wings. Now watch where it flew. She died in 1891, but the framework she built did not die with her. Theosophical Society kept publishing, keep teaching. The idea of root races, of Atlantean blood flowing forward through history into a chosen people, moved through European occult circles the way a rumor moves through a crowd, quietly at first, then louder, then everywhere. In Vienna, two men were paying very close attention. Guido von List was an Austrian nationalist and self-described mystic who believes that the ancient Germanic peoples were the direct descendants of a superior prehistoric race. He called their lost spiritual tradition the Armanen. He built his mythology from fragments of Norse legend, theosophical theory, and his own invented history. His followers were not fringe eccentrics. They were educated, middle-class Austrians who wanted an origin story that made them feel chosen. Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels went further. He founded a journal called Ostara, which he filled with race theory dressed up as spiritual revelation. He proposed that the Aryan race descended from godlike beings who had once ruled the earth. Lesser races, in his telling, were the result of corruption and interbreeding. The solution he proposed was not subtle. He wanted racial purification. He wanted it systematically. He wanted it enforced. One of the young men who read Ostara in Vienna around 1909 was Adolf Hitler. That sentence deserves a moment of silence. The line from Plato's dialogue to a young Hitler reading race mystic pamphlets in a cold Vienna room is not straight. It bends through Donnelly and Blavatsky and List and Lanz. But it is a line, and it connects. Hitler absorbed the idea that Germanic people were the inheritors of a superior prehistoric civilization. He absorbed the idea that history was a story of racial struggle, of pure blood corrupted by lesser races. He did not invent these ideas. He received them from a tradition that addressed pseudo-history in the language of spiritual authority and called it truth. The smell in those Vienna reading rooms would have been paper and coal smoke. The sound would have been the scratch of a pen, the turn of a page. Nothing dramatic, nothing but announced itself as the beginning of something catastrophic. That is almost always how it starts. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the mythology needed an institution. It needed an apparatus. Heinrich Himmler would build it. Himmler was the head of the SS, and he was, in the truest sense, a true believer. He did not use racial mythology as mere propaganda. He lived inside it. He believed, with the sincerity of a man who has never questioned a single conviction, that the Germanic people were the living descendants of an ancient Aryan master race. And he believed that if he could find the archaeological proof of that origin, he could justify everything the Nazi state intended to do. In 1935, he founded the Ahnenerbe. The name means something like ancestral heritage. The reality was a research organization funded by the SS, staffed by academics and archaeologists and historians, and pointed like a weapon at the past. Its mission was to find evidence of Aryan supremacy, not to investigate, not to discover, to find what had already been decided was there. The Ahnenerbe sent expeditions to Iceland, searching for evidence of the Norse-Aryan homeland. They sent researchers to Finland and Scandinavia. They commissioned studies of ancient ruins, of prehistoric monuments, of burial practices across northern Europe. Every finding was bent toward the same predetermined conclusion. The ancestors were great. The ancestors were Aryan. The ancestors were us. In 1938, Himmler sent an expedition to Tibet. Ernst Schaffer led the mission. He was a genuine scientist, a zoologist and explorer, and he was uncomfortable with the ideological pressure surrounding the trip. But the expedition went, and part of what it was looking for, beneath the scientific framing, was evidence of an ancient Aryan migration. The theory, popular in certain Ahnenerbe circles, held that a branch of the original Atlantean Aryan race had migrated east into Central Asia. The high plateaus of Tibet might preserve traces of that original civilization. Schaffer brought back measurements of Tibetan skulls. He brought back photographs and film footage. The Ahnenerbe used all of it as evidence of what they had already decided was true. Science as theater, research as ritual confirmation. And then there was Antarctica. In 1938 and 39, Germany sent an expedition to the Antarctic continent. The official purpose was to survey territory for potential whaling operations. Germany needed resources. The Southern Ocean was rich. The expedition was real science conducted by real sailors and researchers. But around it, and sometimes through it, ran a current of something else entirely. Nazi theorists had been circulating a proposal for years. The idea was this: Atlantis had not sunk beneath the Atlantic. It had moved, or rather, the remnants of the Atlantean civilization had retreated as the ice ages shifted the world to the one place no one had yet fully explored: Antarctica. The frozen continent at the bottom of the world might contain, beneath its ice sheets, the ruins of the original master civilization. The expedition mapped over 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic territory. They dropped markers claiming it for the Reich. They named the territory New Schwabenland. New Swabia. They were planting a flag on what some of them genuinely believed might be the ancestral homeland of their race. They found ice. They found wind. They found the brutal, indifferent cold of the most inhospitable place on Earth. The sensation of Antarctic air on exposed skin is like touching metal in a freezer. It burns. It does not feel like the birthplace of a master civilization. It feels like the end of the world. But the expedition became, after the war, the seed of one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in modern history. Some people claimed the Nazis had found something there, had built bases there, had hidden there after the defeat. None of it was true. All of it spread. This is what pseudo-history does when it meets catastrophe. It does not die. It mutates again. Back in Germany, The Anunnaki was doing something far worse than searching for Atlantis in frozen wastelands. By the early 1940s, it had become directly involved in the machinery of the Holocaust. Anunnaki researchers conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners. They collected skeletons from murdered Jewish people to build a racial anatomy collection at the University of Strasbourg, the same institution that had been founded to prove the glory of the Aryan race was now using the bodies of murdered human beings as research material. The distance from Plato's philosophical dialogue to that laboratory in Strasbourg is enormous. It spans 2,000 years. It passes through Renaissance scholars and Jesuit missionaries and a Minnesota congressman and a Russian mystic. But the road exists, and walking it, step by step, is one of the most uncomfortable things that honest intellectual history requires. The Atlantis myth did not cause the Holocaust. That must be said clearly. The Holocaust had causes rooted in centuries of European anti-Semitism, in the specific catastrophe of the First World War, in economic collapse and political failure, and the particular genius of one man for channeling mass hatred into organized murder. Atlantis was not the cause, but the mythology of a lost Aryan super race, built on the foundation that Donnelly's book had helped construct, gave the ideology a cosmology. It gave hatred a creation story. It made the murder of millions feel, to those doing the murdering, like the restoration of a divine order. That is what pseudo-history can do in the hands of the powerful. It does not just distort the past, it licenses the future. The war ended in 1945. Berlin fell in rubble and ash. Himmler swallowed a cyanide capsule and died on the floor of a British detention facility. The Anunnaki was dissolved. Its records were captured, studied, and archived as evidence of what state-sponsored pseudoscience looks like at its absolute worst. And Atlantis survived all of it. Scarred, contaminated, freighted with associations that would take decades to even begin to process. For a generation of serious archaeologists and historians, the word Atlantis had become radioactive. Any researcher who expressed genuine curiosity about prehistoric civilization, about the possibility of complex cultures before the conventional timeline, risked being associated with the fringe, with the obsessives, with the people who had sent expeditions to Antarctica looking for the master race. That contamination was not fair, but it was real, and it had consequences for legitimate inquiry that would last for decades. Because here is what is true: the questions that Plato raised are not inherently dangerous. Whether a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization collapsed in a catastrophic event is a geological question, an archaeological question, a historical question. It deserves serious investigation. The problem was never the question. The problem was who had been asking it and why, and what they had been willing to do with the answer. The Nazis did not discover Atlantis. They did not find the Aryan homeland. They found nothing in Tibet, and nothing in Antarctica, and nothing in the rune stones of Scandinavia that proved a single word of what they believed. The evidence was never there, because the premise was never true. What they left behind was wreckage, not just in the cities they had bombed and the people they had murdered. In the intellectual landscape too. They had taken a story about the fragility of civilization, a story Plato had told as a warning, and turned it into a weapon pointed at the very idea of shared human dignity. And yet, even as the ruins of Berlin were still smoldering, a different kind of search was beginning, not ideological, not political. Scientific. A Greek archaeologist was looking at the shattered remains of an island in the Aegean Sea. at layers of volcanic ash and buried cities and ancient pottery, and beginning to ask a question that Plato might have recognized. What if the story was not invented? What if it was a memory? That search would lead to a discovery that would come closer to solving the mystery of Atlantis than anything before or since. Stand on the edge of the caldera at Santorini on a clear morning, and the world looks like it was designed by someone showing off. The white buildings, the impossible blue, the water so still and so deep, it seems less like a sea and more like a hole cut through the earth. Tourists photograph it constantly. They cannot help themselves. It is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. But look down. Look at the shape of the water beneath you. That caldera, that vast circular bowl of sea, is not a natural bay. It is a wound. What you are standing on is the broken rim of a volcano that tore itself apart with such violence that the explosion was heard, according to some estimates, over 3,000 miles away. The mountain did not erupt, it ceased to exist, and in its place the sea rushed in. In 1939, a Greek archaeologist named Spyridon Marinatos looked at this island and saw something no one else had seen. He saw Atlantis, not metaphorically, not poetically, scientifically. Marinatos had spent years excavating sites on the island of Crete, the heart of what scholars call the Minoan civilization. And he kept finding the same thing buried in the soil: volcanic pumice, ash, the physical debris of a catastrophic eruption, layered over ruins that had been abandoned in a hurry. He found buildings that had been destroyed not by war, but by something enormous coming from above and from the sea. He found evidence of a wave so large it had reached inland and left its mark in stone. He published his hypothesis in the journal Antiquity. The volcanic eruption of the island of Thera, modern Santorini, roughly around 1500 BCE, had destroyed the Minoan civilization, and that destruction, he argued, was the historical memory buried inside Plato's story of Atlantis. It was a serious proposal from a serious man, and after the ideological wreckage of the previous 2 decades, after the Nazis and the mystics and the race theorists, it felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been locked shut for years. Here was a question being asked without an agenda. Here was evidence you could touch. So, who were the Minoans? That is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. The Minoan civilization was one of the most sophisticated cultures the ancient world produced. Based on Crete and spreading across the Aegean islands, it dominated the eastern Mediterranean for roughly 1,000 years. The palace at Knossos on Crete was not a fortress. It was something far more confident than a fortress. It was a complex of over 1,000 rooms, with running water, with drainage systems, with storage facilities that could feed a city. The people who built it were not afraid of their neighbors. They were their neighbors' envy. Their art alone stops you cold. Frescoes of dolphins and leaping young men. Images of women in elaborate dress attending ceremonies we still cannot fully decode. A culture that celebrated the body, the sea, the natural world, with a lightness and a joy that feels almost modern, almost familiar. They had a writing system called Linear A. We have never deciphered it. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called themselves. The name Minoan comes from a Greek legend about King Minos, a ruler of Crete, and it was given to them by the archaeologist Arthur Evans when he excavated Knossos in the early 1900s. They are, in a very real sense, a civilization that left us its art and its architecture and almost nothing of its words. What we know is that they were a naval power. Their trade routes reached Egypt and the Levant and mainland Greece. They were not conquerors in the way later civilizations were. They were traders, merchants, explorers. Their influence spread through commerce and culture rather than through armies. The sea was their road, and they traveled it with extraordinary confidence. And then, around 1500 to 1450 BCE, it ended, not slowly. Suddenly, the palaces on Crete were destroyed. Knossos survived a little longer, but it too fell within a generation. The frescoes were buried. The storerooms were emptied or burned. The trade networks collapsed, and the Mycenaeans, those mainland Greeks who had been watching the Minoans with something between admiration and appetite, moved in. The cause of the collapse is still debated, but Marinatos pointed at Thera and said, "Look there." The eruption of Thera was not an ordinary volcanic event. Scientists now estimate it was one of the largest eruptions in human history. It released energy equivalent to several hundred atomic bombs. It launched ash into the stratosphere. It generated tsunamis that struck the northern coast of Crete with waves that may have reached 30 meters in height. It would have darkened the sky for months. It would have destroyed harvests across the eastern Mediterranean. It would have killed thousands in minutes, and thousands more in the years of cold and famine that followed. If you were standing on Crete on the morning the mountain collapsed, the sound alone would have been enough to stop your heart. This is what Marinatos believed had broken the Minoans, not invasion, not internal collapse. The earth itself turning against them. The confirmation came from an unexpected place. In 1967, a team of archaeologists led by Marinatos himself began excavating a site on the southern end of Santorini called Akrotiri. They expected to find ruins. What they found was a city, a complete, preserved, extraordinary Bronze Age city buried under meters of volcanic ash. Multi-story buildings still standing, staircases intact, pottery still sitting on shelves, drainage systems running beneath the streets. More sophisticated than anything found elsewhere in the ancient world at that date. And on the walls, the frescoes, intact after 3,500 years. Images of swallows in flight, a young boy carrying fish, a fleet of ships sailing between islands decorated with flowers and ceremony. The smell of the dig must have been ancient dust and cold stone. The feeling of pressing your hand against a wall that no human being had touched since the Bronze Age must have been something close to reverence. People called it the Pompeii of the Aegean. The comparison is apt. The ash that buried Akrotiri preserved it the same way Vesuvius preserved Pompeii. A catastrophe became an archive. The destruction that ended the city also saved it, and crucially, unlike Pompeii, almost no human remains were found at Akrotiri. The people had left. They had felt the warning tremors, gathered what they could carry, and gone. They knew what was coming. They just could not have known how completely it would erase the world they had built. Now, here is the case for Thera as Atlantis, laid out as cleanly as the evidence allows. You have an island civilization in the Aegean, west of Egypt, north of Crete. You have a culture of extraordinary sophistication, naval dominance, and advanced architecture. You have a catastrophic sudden destruction caused by a natural event of almost incomprehensible violence. You have a collapse so total that it ended not just a city, but an entire civilization, leaving behind only fragments and mystery. And you have a destruction date, roughly 1500 BCE, that places it well within the range of human memory and oral tradition. Plato wrote his account around 360 BCE. That is over 1,000 years after the eruption. Oral tradition across 1,000 years does strange things to numbers and distances and scale. Marinatos and later scholars, particularly the Greek geologist Angelos Gallanopoulos in the 1960s, proposed that the famous 9,000 years Plato cited was a transmission error. Egyptian records used a symbol for 100 that could be confused with 1 for 1,000. If you divide Plato's 9,000 years by 10, you get 900 years. 900 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, roughly 600 BCE, brings you to 1500 BCE. The eruption. It is elegant. It is plausible. It is the kind of solution that makes you want it to be true. But here is where the honest accounting begins. Thera is in the Aegean Sea. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is what the ancient world called the Strait of Gibraltar. That is not a minor geographical discrepancy. Plato is specific. He says the island lay in the Atlantic Ocean, outside the known world. Thera is inside the known world. It was a well-traveled part of the Mediterranean that Greek sailors had navigated for centuries. Plato would have known exactly where Thera was. The size is also wrong. Plato describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia combined. That is a continent, not an island. Thera, even before the eruption, was a modest volcanic island. Akrotiri was an impressive city, but it was not a continent-spanning empire. Then there is the enemy. Plato says Atlantis attacked Athens and Egypt. The Minoans were not conquerors. There is no evidence they ever launched a military campaign against mainland Greece. Their relationship with the Mycenaeans was complicated, possibly tense, but it was not the story of an aggressive empire pressing against the civilized world. That detail, which is central to Plato's moral argument, simply does not fit, and the timeline, even with the factor of 10 correction, requires Plato or his Egyptian sources to have made an error so large it transforms the entire story. You are asking us to accept that a number was multiplied by 10 somewhere in the chain of transmission and no one noticed. That is possible. Oral traditions do distort numbers, but it is a significant ask. What you are left with is a hypothesis that is genuinely compelling and genuinely incomplete. The Minoan civilization is the most scientifically credible candidate for the historical kernel of Plato's story. Many serious archaeologists accept some version of it. The eruption of Thera was real. The destruction of a sophisticated island culture was real. The memory of that catastrophe, rippling forward through centuries of oral tradition and Egyptian records, and eventually reaching Plato's ears, is entirely plausible. But it cannot explain everything Plato wrote. The numbers are wrong. The location is wrong. The enemy is wrong. And if Plato drew on real history but changed the details to serve his philosophical argument, then we are not looking for a sunken continent. We are looking for something far stranger. A philosophical lie built around a historical truth, a warning dressed up as a story, using fragments of real catastrophe to make a point about the dangers of power and pride and the fragility of everything we build. Which raises the question every serious Atlantis researcher eventually has to answer. What if we have been looking in completely the wrong place? So here is where we stood, not looking for a sunken continent anymore, looking for the wound, the real historical injury that bled into legend, traveled through centuries of retelling, and finally landed on Plato's writing table as raw material for a philosophical argument. That reframing changes everything about how you search. By the end of the 20th century, we had mapped more of the ocean floor than the surface of Mars. sonar, deep-sea submersibles, satellite bathymetry that can read the contours of the seabed from orbit, and we found no sunken continent, no ancient harbors, no submerged temples in the middle of the Atlantic. What we found was more complicated than absence, and more interesting. The Atlantic floor is not a mystery anymore. It is a known landscape, mid-ocean ridges, abyssal plains, volcanic seamounts rising from the dark. The Azores sit above one of those volcanic systems, 3 tectonic plates grinding against each other. Beautiful islands. Real islands, but not the ruins of something larger. Geological studies confirm those islands have actually risen over time, not sunk. The sea floor around them shows no evidence of a submerged continental shelf. No lost civilization hiding just below the surface. The Canary Islands, same story. Rising, not falling. Geologically active, yes. Catastrophically drowned, no. So if the Atlantic gives us nothing, where do serious researchers look? Here is where the Troy precedent becomes important. In 1870, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann took Homer's Iliad, treated it as a geographical guide rather than a poem, and started digging in northwestern Turkey. Every classical scholar of his era told him he was wasting his time. Troy was myth. Everyone knew that. Then he found walls. Then he found treasure. Then he found layer after layer of cities built on top of each other, each one corresponding to a different era of occupation. The lesson was not that all myths are literally true. The lesson was that ancient storytellers sometimes preserved real geographical and historical memories inside fictional frameworks. The shape of the story might be invention. The location embedded in it might be real. That is the possibility that drives serious Atlantis research. Not treasure hunting, not mysticism. A genuine archaeological question about how far back human memory can reach. With that in mind, look at the Spartel Bank hypothesis. Jacques Collina-Girard, a French geologist, published a proposal in 2001 that is worth taking seriously. During the last glacial maximum, sea level sat roughly 135 meters below where they are today. At that point, the Strait of Gibraltar looked completely different. A shallow bank just west of the strait, now submerged, was above water. An island, small, maybe 10 to 12 kilometers across, but real. As the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, that island shrank. Then around 9,400 BC, a rapid pulse of meltwater accelerated the flooding. The island drowned. Marine geophysicist Marc-André Gutcher added another piece. The geology of that region is seismically active, capable of producing earthquakes and tsunamis comparable to the catastrophic Lisbon earthquake of 1755. Here, then, is a real island, near the Pillars of Hercules, destroyed by flooding, at roughly the right time. Collina-Girard suggests its disappearance was recorded in prehistoric Egyptian tradition for 5,000 years before the first Egyptian scribes wrote it down, a small island swallowed by the sea, growing in the telling over millennia, until it became something vast and terrible. Scholars who reviewed his work said he had illuminated something genuinely interesting about prehistoric geography near Gibraltar. They also said he had not found Plato's Atlantis. The island was too small. The dates still required a long chain of oral transmission. And Plato's description is so elaborate, so architecturally specific, that a 10-kilometer sandbank strains the imagination as its source. Then there is the Rishat structure, and this one is harder to dismiss, not because the evidence is stronger, but because it is visually arresting in a way that stops you cold. In the Sahara Desert in Mauritania, there is a geological formation called the Richat structure. From the air, it looks like a target. Concentric rings of rock, each ring separated from the next, stretching roughly 50 kilometers across. It formed from the erosion of a domed geological uplift over millions of years. Scientists have studied it for decades as a natural feature. Nothing controversial there, but look at Plato's description of Atlantis again. The city built on a hill, rings of land and water surrounding it, alternating bands of stone quarried in red, white, and black. A diameter that matches, at least roughly, the scale of the structure. The Richat sits near what ancient geographers called the Atlas Mountains. It sits near the Atlantic coast of Africa, outside the Pillars of Hercules. Popular YouTube channels picked this up in recent years and generated enormous mainstream attention. The videos are compelling. The visual match between Plato's concentric rings and the Richat's concentric geology is genuinely striking. And for a brief moment you feel it. The recognition, the sense that something fits. Then you look harder. The Richat structure sits in the middle of a desert, not near the sea. Plato describes a maritime empire with harbors and naval power. The structure itself shows no evidence of human habitation at the scale Plato describes. Archaeological surveys found only short-term hunting camps and stone tool manufacture. No monumental architecture, no city, no civilization. The visual resemblance is real. The archaeological substance is not there. What the Richat moment reveals is something important about how this search works. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. Show us concentric rings and tell us Plato described concentric rings, and we feel certainty before we have examined a single piece of evidence. The history of Atlantis research is littered with that feeling. It is the feeling that has kept this search alive for 2,000 years. Genuine researchers know the feeling and distrust it. So what does the honest state of current knowledge look like? Mainstream archaeology does not accept Atlantis as a historical place. That position has not changed. No peer-reviewed excavation report has ever uncovered a civilization matching Plato's description in any of the proposed locations. The ocean floor mapping of the 20th century eliminated the literal interpretation once and for all. There is no sunken continent in the Atlantic, but a growing number of researchers in geology, oceanography, and archaeology take seriously a narrower and more careful question. Not whether Atlantis was real, whether Plato drew on real catastrophic events, whether the Thera eruption or the flooding of the Black Sea as rising post-glacial waters broke through the Bosporus around 5500 BC, or the dramatic end of Ice Age sea level rise that drowned coastal settlements across the ancient world. Whether any of these fed into the story Plato eventually told, the Black Sea flooding is worth pausing on. Before roughly 5500 BC, what is now the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, significantly smaller than the current body of water. When rising Mediterranean levels finally breached the natural barrier at the Bosporus, seawater poured in. Catastrophically, a vast fertile plain drowned. Communities living on its shores fled or perished. German researchers Siegfried and Christian Schopp have proposed that this event, a real geological catastrophe, preserved itself in human memory as the Atlantis story, with the Pillars of Hercules transposed to the Bosporus. The geography does not match Plato, but the emotional scale does. A world ending, water taking everything, people running from something that could not be outrun. That is the kind of event that becomes myth. And that is the central insight the best researchers keep returning to. Plato was not writing a geography textbook. He was working with whatever fragments of catastrophe human memory had preserved, shaping them into a moral argument. The Spartel Bank drowning. The Thera eruption. The memory of Minoan collapse. Any of these, or some combination of all of them, could have reached his ears through the long chain of Egyptian records and Greek oral tradition and Solon's travels. He took those fragments and built something new. A story precise enough to feel like history, vague enough to be placed almost anywhere. That precision and that vagueness are not accidents. They are the work of a master storyteller who wanted his audience to believe, at least for a moment, that this was real, because the warning only lands if you think it could actually happen. Empires do not fall in stories. They fall in reality. And if Atlantis felt real, then the lesson felt real too. We have searched the Atlantic, we have searched the Mediterranean, we have searched the seafloor with technology Plato could not have imagined. And we are still arguing, not because we are foolish, but because the story Plato told is precise enough to be convincing and vague enough to accommodate almost anything. Which brings us, finally, back to the only question that has ever mattered, not where is Atlantis? But why did Plato tell this story? What was he really trying to say? And what if the answer has been hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years? We have been searching for 2,000 years. And perhaps the most honest thing we can say is this: we may have been asking the wrong question all along. Not where is Atlantis, but why did a man who spent his entire life warning against the seductions of fiction write the most seductive fiction in the Western world? Plato was not a novelist. He was a philosopher, and in 360 BC, he was watching his city come apart. Athens had already lost the Peloponnesian War. A generation of young men had bled out in Sicily, sent on an imperial adventure that achieved nothing and cost everything. The great democracy Plato had grown up inside had voted to execute Socrates, his teacher, the wisest man he had ever known. Plato had watched them do it. He had seen what happens when a civilization becomes so proud of its own power that it stops asking whether power is being used wisely. He sat down and wrote a story about exactly that. Atlantis is a naval empire, wealthy beyond measure, architecturally magnificent, ringed with concentric harbors, clad in precious metal, blessed by Poseidon himself. It expands outward, conquering Libya, Egypt, parts of Europe. It grows and grows, certain of its own greatness, until the gods look down and see what it has become. Not great, corrupt. And then comes the single day and the single night, and then the sea. Look at what Plato placed opposite Atlantis, a fictionalized Athens, small, disciplined, uncorrupted by wealth, fighting alone after its allies deserted, holding the line against an empire. This is not an accident. Plato's scholar Julia Annis, Regents Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, put it plainly. The story, she said, is a device of fiction. It uses the appearance of history to make a philosophical point. We were meant to think about government and power, not to go searching the seafloor. Aristotle said the same thing. His teacher invented the island to teach philosophy. Gone now. The lesson remains. But here is where it becomes genuinely complicated. Because Plato was not working in a vacuum, he had access to Egyptian records through Solon, who traveled between 590 and 580 BC. He had Greek oral traditions reaching back to the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, a catastrophe so total it erased entire civilizations in a single generation. He knew about the Thera eruption. He almost certainly knew about Hellege, a Greek city swallowed by the sea in 373 BC, just years before he wrote these dialogues. He may have drawn on the physical layout of Syracuse, where he had tried and failed to build his ideal state. The concentric harbors, the rings of water, the city of Atlantis built on a hill. Syracuse looked like that. Plato did what Shakespeare did. He took real history, real geography, real catastrophe, and shaped it into moral argument. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar really lived. The senators really stabbed him. But Shakespeare was not writing history. He was writing about ambition and consequence, and what happens when great men stop listening to the people who love them. Plato was doing the same thing. The floods were real. The drowned civilizations were real. The hubris was real. He assembled the pieces and pointed them at his own city and said, "Look." And then something remarkable happened. Something Plato perhaps intended and perhaps feared. People believed him, not just a few credulous readers. Entire ages, each one finding in the story exactly what it needed most. Renaissance thinkers looked at Plato's Atlantis and saw the New World. Francisco Lopez de Gomara was the first to say it plainly. Plato was describing America. Francis Bacon built an entire utopia on that foundation. His New Atlantis, a vision of a perfect society somewhere beyond the western horizon. Thomas More followed. The Americas became the place where civilization could begin again, uncorrupted. Atlantis became the promise of a second chance. Then, the 19th century arrived. Ignatius Donnelly published his Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882 and turned Plato's philosophical fable into the origin point of all human civilization. Every ancient culture, every myth, every pyramid, every flood story, all of it descended from one lost mother continent. Donnelly was not a scholar. He was a congressman from Minnesota with a magnificent obsession. But he gave the modern world its version of the myth. And that version has never really left. Helena Blavatsky took Donnelly's Atlantis and made it spiritual. The Atlanteans became a root race, a stage in human evolution, a people of psychic power who destroyed themselves through the misuse of that power. Then the Nazis arrived and found in Atlantis what they needed too. A master race, a Nordic homeland, a lost greatness waiting to be reclaimed. The same story, a completely different poison. Then the New Age movement arrived and found crystal energy. Then geologists arrived and found Bronze Age geology. Then geologists arrived and found Bronze Age shorelines. Each age, each anxiety, each dream. The same story absorbs all of them. This is not a coincidence. It is the design. Plato built Atlantis to be a mirror, precise enough to feel real, vague enough to reflect whatever you bring to it. He placed it beyond the Pillars of Hercules because that is where the unknown was. Out past the edge of the map, where certainty ends and imagination begins. He gave it a date so ancient, 9,000 years before his time, that no one could verify or disprove it. He gave it dimensions detailed enough to feel surveyed and descriptions rich enough to feel remembered, and then he sank it in a single day and a single night. because that is what happens to civilizations that forget what power is for. Here is the circularity that should stop you cold. Plato wrote a story about a civilization so proud of itself, so certain of its own greatness, so dazzled by its own wealth and beauty and military reach, that it destroyed itself. And we have spent 2,000 years arguing about whether that civilization was real. We have searched the Atlantic. We have dredged the Mediterranean. We have scanned the seafloor with sonar. We have proposed Sardinia and the Azores and Antarctica and Ireland and the Richat structure in Mauritania. We have written thousands of books and produced hundreds of documentaries and convened academic conferences, all to find a place that a philosopher invented to warn us about exactly this kind of prideful certainty. Plato may have intended that too. The search itself as the lesson, the inability to let go, the desperate need to believe that somewhere, once, there was a civilization greater than ours and that its fall was a warning meant for someone else. That need is very human, and it is very dangerous. Plato wrote about a civilization that had everything: power, beauty, wealth, knowledge, and lost it because it forgot what all of those things were for. He set this story beyond the edge of the known world because that is where warnings belong, not in the center of the map, where we live and work and tell ourselves we are different, but out there, in the dark water, just past the point where certainty ends. That is where Atlantis has always been, and that is exactly where Plato intended it to stay.